Hello everyone, I'm JG and welcome back to Music Forever, where today I'm bringing you guys a brand new catch-up review video where I get to talk about several projects released earlier in 2019 that for whatever reason I have a chance to cover in full when they initially dropped. I'm just going to be going through these three projects I'm going to talk about here today, sharing my general thoughts on them in as quick a manner as I can, hopefully. And yeah, that's really all there is to it. This is just my own personal opinion, so if you happen to disagree or have an opinion that's different than mine to any extent, that's perfectly fine. In fact, feel free to leave your own thoughts on any of these projects I talked about here today in the comment section down below. With that said, let's get into this review. For my first project I want to talk about here today, the newest EP from Panopticon, the Crescendo of Dusk. Now, this EP was one that just kind of slipped under my radar when this initially dropped earlier this year. It is a follow-up of sorts to the project's last album that came out last year, which was a double album that, as I said in my review of that project, I didn't really care for all too much. I was pretty indifferent towards the project overall, because considering in that double album it saw this project splitting up two of its main sound components into each of the two discs that made up that project. The first disc being a mostly atmospheric black metal focused effort, and the second one focusing more on the kind of folkier Americana music that this music project has also incorporated into its sound. And for, there were some good moments on that last project, but overall wasn't one I particularly care for all too much. This new EP here, actually, only one of the two tracks that appear on this thing is from the recording sessions of that last project. The other track on this thing is from the Autumn Eternal sessions. And overall, I will say that this EP here is pretty solid. Kind of like the last studio album from this project, this EP consists of two tracks. The first one has more of the atmospheric black metal sound, and the latter of the two tracks once again focuses more on the folkier, more Americana-themed sound that this group has also done before in the past. Unlike that last studio album, however, where I feel like splitting these sounds into two separate discs kind of made the overall sound of this project a bit less interesting, I feel like in the context of this EP it works a lot better, considering that this project is overall a lot shorter. Like it is an EP, only around 20 minutes or so in length. It just works a lot better in my opinion. It makes both of these tracks kind of stand out and be, unique within the context of this EP. I will say that neither of these tracks are necessarily groundbreaking for the sound of this project as a whole. Essentially, if you're familiar with Panopticon, nothing on this EP is really going to shock you, but at the same time, you're getting some pretty solid cuts on this thing. The first track on this EP, like I said, the black metal focused track, overall is a pretty interesting composition. It's the lengthier cut here on this project, being over 10 minutes in length, close to 15 minutes in length, and there's a lot going on here in this track that's really enjoyable. I like how this track has several different components to it, giving each segment of the track its own unique vibe, and it just makes the entire track a lot more interesting and engaging, really. I love the vocals on this first track as well, how kind of primal and raw they sound overall. I do feel like this first track on here would have been one of my favorite cuts on that last project had it been included there, because overall it is a pretty solid composition from start to finish. I'm not going to say it's one of my favorites of the year or anything, but it's pretty good. The second track on this EP, The Labyrinth, is a bit more of a cool down from that first track. Once again, this track is a bit softer overall, focuses more on that folkier, almost country-like vibe that this project has taken influence from in the past on multiple occasions. The metal influence really is not apparent on this track at all. However, given the first track on this EP being mostly metal focused, it's kind of a nice breath of fresh air to the second track that immediately follows it. Overall, I would say that this EP is pretty solid from start to finish. I like the diversity and the sound that you get here on this thing between the two tracks. I like the fact that both tracks on this thing feel really well developed. They pair up really nicely, which is kind of surprising considering they came from two different recording sessions, but they pair up in a way that I think works really well overall, and it makes for a really engaging listen. Like I said, this thing isn't necessarily breaking new ground or anything like that. This is mostly a project that I think fans of this music project are going to like more so than newcomers, but it's a solid listen overall. It's one that you should definitely check out if you're a fan of Panopticon, if you're a fan of black metal, it's worth a listen. Moving on, the next project I'm going to be talking about is the newest album from the Claypool Lennon Delirium, South of Reality. This is the collaborative music project between Les Claypool, most notably of Primus fame, and Sean Lennon, the son of famous musician John Lennon. I hadn't heard any material from this project prior to this album. However, I was familiar with some of Les Claypool's music projects prior to this thing. Wasn't familiar with Sean Lennon and any of his previous music work. However, of course, I am familiar with his father's musical work. And while that might not sound super relevant, given that, of course, John and Sean Lennon are two different people, Sean definitely is very influenced by his father when it comes not only to the sound of the music that he makes here on this project, but also when it comes to even just the sound of his voice. He's very reminiscent of John in some regards, which I guess makes sense given that he's his son. It's just pretty fortunate in Sean's regard that he was able to inherit one of the better aspects of his father. Overall, I think this is a pretty enjoyable project. It's a nice mixture between psychedelic rock, some progressive rock, and some funk rock thrown in there for good measure as well. It's a pretty nice blend of all these different sounds, and it ends up coming out in a pretty unique style at the end of the day, really. While this thing certainly, isn't necessarily treading new ground, I would say, considering a lot of the genres that it pulls from aren't, super new by any means, it manages to mix and match them in such a way where the end, product is still relatively exciting and enjoyable. Throughout this thing, I like the relationship that exists between Sean's vocals, which are, like I said, more like his father's vocals. If you're familiar with those, Sean's are pretty similar overall, and Les Claypool's more quirky, out there vocal style. They're not very similar, but at the same time they work together in a way that just pairs up really nicely, and they flows together really in a really charming manner, I guess you could say. I also really like a lot of Les Claypool's bass work on this project as well, considering a lot of psychedelic rock out there isn't necessarily bass driven necessarily. I like the fact that this project does have some really popping and exciting bass in it. It definitely makes this project stand out a bit from a lot of the other psychedelic rock that's been made in the many years of rock's history. You have cuts on this thing like Blood and Rockets and Amethyst Realm that are just these longer, more psychedelic, kind of progressive leaning cuts on this thing. I especially like the track Blood and Rockets, which has several different segments to it. I love a lot of the vocal performances on this thing as well. I love the overall vibe of the track. Probably my favorite song on the entire album. It really embodies a lot of what I love that's present here on this project. While there's a lot I like here on this album, I wouldn't say that this is a perfect project by any means. There are some cuts on this project that I think are just kind of uninteresting or maybe a bit more forgettable overall. The opening track to this thing, Little Fishes, is one that just doesn't really do a whole ton for me. It feels a little awkward at times, and I don't really feel like the mixture between the more psychedelic sounds and some of the funkier elements really blends together in a way that's really nice, I guess you could say. It's not a terrible cut, but it's not one that I think is super great either. Kind of a weak starting point to the album, in my opinion. And then towards the end of the project, there's also some other weaker, more forgettable cuts, like the track Today's Man's Hour or Cricket Chronicles, and even the last track, like Fleas, which is probably the most forgettable and least interesting cut on this entire project. When this project wants to be good, it's really good. There's a lot of really nice sounds going on here. I love the mixture of psychedelic, funk, and progressive rock. I love the relationship between the different vocals on this thing. I love the really popping bass sounds that pop up on this thing as well. The best cuts on this thing are really enjoyable overall. It's just unfortunate that this album is kind of dragged down by some of the weaker, more forgettable cuts that pop up on this album as well. Overall, I think this is a pretty good album. Even the weakest moments on this thing, while there are a fair amount of them, I guess you could say, none of them are really downright awful or painful to listen to or anything like that. And the good moments on this thing, like I said, are pretty great overall. So yeah, overall, I think this is a good album. One that's definitely worth checking out if you're a fan of either artist involved in this project. If you're a fan of psychedelic rock, funk rock, progressive rock, sounds like that, then I think you'll like this project to some extent. Overall, pretty good album. Just wish maybe it was a little bit better overall. Moving on, the final project I want to talk about here today is the newest album from Little Simz, gray area. I wasn't familiar with Little Simz prior to the release of this project. I mostly checked it out because a lot of the really positive reviews I'd seen for this thing. And overall, I'm really happy I did check this out because I could happily say that I'm going to be adding to that collection of very positive reviews for this thing that already exists out there because, like a lot of people, I ended up really liking this album overall. I'm not super familiar with a lot of UK hip-hop, so I really can't comment on that aspect of this project, or at least I don't really have the context in order to do so. However, I will say that I do really enjoy this project, and I really like the sound that Little Simz has developed for herself here on this thing. I really like a lot of the production here on this album. It's very raw and natural sounding, especially a lot of the drum parts, the guitar parts, the bass parts as well. They all sound like they're coming more from live instruments than anything that's a bit more synthetic overall. It gives this album a pretty unique vibe to it, and I think it creates a really unique and interesting sound here that's very just enjoyable, but at the same time very attention grabbing too for how different it is. I also really like a lot of the various different just tones that a lot of these tracks carry to them. You have cuts on this thing like the opening track Offense or the track Venom that comes later in the track listing that are just more aggressive in your face cuts, but at the same time you also have more introspective cuts that are focused a bit more on storytelling, especially in the latter half of this album, especially towards the end with cuts like Therapy, Sherbert Sunset, Flowers, among others. A lot of these tracks have some really great storytelling in them, and all of this is further helped by Little Simz and her flows that appear on this thing. She's a really great rapper overall. I love a lot of the flows and just lyrics that she's able to pull out here on this project, not just when it comes to storytelling, but also when it comes to things like wordplay and things like that. She's overall a really great MC, and she's really able to help sell a lot of the emotion and just the overall vibe that a lot of these tracks are trying to go for. I also really like the fact that this album isn't super bloated or doesn't really have much filler to it. I'd say it's all pretty lean, it's all pretty stripped back, but at the same time it's very to the point, and I like that fact about it. While I do really like a lot of this album, there are some minor complaints and nitpicks, I guess you could say, that I have with it. In particular, I think the track Wounds overall is just not super interesting compared to some of the rest of the album. It's probably the least interesting cut on this thing overall, and probably my least favorite because of it. Also, the track Boss, while there's a lot of aspects to this track I like the production and the lyrics and things like that, I'm not the biggest fan of some of the vocal manipulations that are put on Little Simz' voice here on this track. They just don't sound very pleasant to me, I guess, simply put. I mean, I like what they were going for, and I could clearly see what they were trying to do with them and trying to make her delivery sound a bit more aggressive overall. I just don't think it ended up doing so in a way that was really pleasant on the ears, I guess. Still not a terrible track by any means. No, I would go as far as to say it's still a pretty good song, in fact. Yeah, this album, you know, I have some minor complaints with it here and there, but overall, it's a pretty great project. I really love the production on this thing and how natural and raw it sounds, but at the same time also how unique and interesting it sounds, especially in today's hip-hop landscape. I also love a lot of Little Simz flows on this thing. I love her lyrics on this thing. I love her storytelling on this thing. I just love a lot of this thing, pretty much, I guess. I think it's a pretty fantastic hip-hop release from this year, and definitely one that you should have on your radar if you're a fan of this genre of music. And with that said, that concludes today's catch-up review. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you have any opinions here that are different than mine in any way, that's perfectly fine. Feel free to leave them in the comment section down below. And while you're down there, make sure you leave a like on the video and subscribe to the channel for more music-related content. Things like album reviews, track reviews, things of that sort. If you like that kind of content, make sure you subscribe. Thank you for watching once again, and stay golden.